Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar on Bylaws Basics. I'm Stuart Reed, I'm the Executive Director at Food Co-op Initiative. We're proud to present this series of informational webinars for startup co-op organizers and their supporters. I understand we've probably got a few established co-ops joining us today as well, and we are glad to have you with us. Food Co-op Initiative is a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing support and resources to people organizing new food co-ops across the U.S. We've helped over 80 new co-ops open grocery stores, and we're currently working with over 120 more communities that are actively pursuing their own. We're here to help you get started down the right path and find the help you need along the way. So if you're just getting started, please give us a call, introduce yourselves, and learn more about our resources. You can find contact information or sign up for our mailing list on our website, which is foodcoopinitiative.coop. Our work is supported by grants from the USDA, National Cooperative Bank, National Co-op Grocers, Co-op Foundation, and the Blooming Prairie Foundation. And we're also supported by donations from co-ops and their members, people like you. So thanks to all of you. We couldn't do without you. So just a couple housekeeping tips here as we get started. The webinar will be recorded and will be available soon on our foodcoopinitiative.coop link and on our YouTube channel. So you can also find our library of previous webinars there on a wide range of topics. Our next webinar is coming up next month, and that will be on, I've forgotten the title. We'll show you that one in a little bit later.
The Monadnock case study.
Yeah, it's a case study from the Monadnock Food Co-op. Thank you. It's a cooperative effort here. If you have questions during this webinar, you can post them on our YouTube page. If you're logged in there, you can give it a try right now by saying hi and hello. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. So be patient, and we'll get to those. And you can also send questions to info@fci.coop at any time during the presentation. Okay, our guests today are Leslie Watson and Thane Joyle. They're both consultants with the CDS Consulting Co-op, and they both specialize in working with boards of directors. And they're great folks. Welcome, and I'll let you take on.
Great. Thanks,
Thank
Stuart.
you very much.
Well, we're really pleased to be here today. I know I speak for Thane. I think I speak for Thane pretty fairly when I say both of us are bylaws enthusiasts. It's work that we both do with co-ops and have a particular affinity and passion for. So we're really pleased to have a chance to tell you just a little bit about what we know and hopefully answer a few questions. Thane, you have anything else as an intro that you'd like to share?
No, I was grateful you didn't say bylaw geeks. I would have owned geekdom.
Well, yeah.
Bylaws are cool.
Aficionados, enthusiasts, advocates.
Very nice.
Great. Good. Well, let me just, maybe we'll go to the next slide, just tell you what we're going to talk about today in the next half hour or so. We're going to spend just a little bit of time actually talking about what bylaws are, and in particular how we distinguish them from the other formative document, Articles of Incorporation. And then we're going to run through just some tips for, at a big picture level, what it takes to draft really good bylaws and some of the things that you might want to keep in mind as you launch into the work. Followed immediately on the heels by a little discussion of the process for adopting bylaws, and that's going to look different depending on whether you're a startup or an existing co-op. So I'll spend just a minute or two talking about both situations. And then Thane is going to lead us through a tour of the sample set of bylaws that CDS Consulting Co-op has on its website and that we offer for any co-op interested in either updating or either a startup or a co-op interested in updating its bylaws. And so she'll walk you through that, along with a few final thoughts about things to keep in mind, and then we'll open it up to your questions. Okay, great. And of course, you're going to hear this theme from us in a couple of different points, but one thing to be really aware of is that, of course, laws vary from state to state, and one thing that you're always going to want to do is check in with an attorney during this process. And so for this webinar, we're just really providing this for information and educational purposes only, and please ask that you not consider it legal advice, and definitely check in with a legal professional in your state who can make sure that it's that you're following all the right rules. So great. So what are bylaws? So here's a definition that I found that I liked, and I think it's really clear, and I think it's from legaldictionary.com or some such place. But it's the rules and the regulations enacted by an organization or a corporation to provide a framework for operation and management. So really, I think of bylaws as a set of agreements that we get in place to help us figure out how we're going to run the organization. And in the case of the co-op, it's really, I would say, a set of agreements that members put in place with the board of directors and then everybody else who's running the organization. So it's really the members are the starting place, and the body of people who are really authorizing the bylaws and really setting the terms around which the organization can move forward to achieve their interests. So that's distinct from the Articles of Incorporation. Articles of Incorporation are, the definition of those, are the document that have to be filed for a business to receive legal recognition, and it has to be filed with a public agency, typically a Secretary of State. And I like to think of the Articles of Incorporation as kind of your business, your co-op's birth certificate. So the Articles of Incorporation are something that you file to actually create the co-op as a legal entity. Typically, they are much less detailed than the bylaws. So most states require, some of them actually have forms that you can just use, but the kinds of things that you find in the Articles of Incorporation are the corporate name and address, corporate purpose, stated at a very broad level. So, you know, we don't usually say, and we're not going to sell GMO products. You know, it's just a little bit more general than that. Name and address of a registered agent, so the person authorized to accept legal papers on behalf of the co-op. And then a description of your capital structure. And there's different ways that you can go about that, but the place where you define it is in your articles. And maybe there's a few other things distinct to your state's law, but that might really be about it. So, of course, it doesn't say anything about annual meetings and quorum and all that stuff. All that stuff is going to actually live in your bylaws. And something important to keep in mind is that the Articles of Incorporation are public, and you are always required to file them with your state. I don't know of a single exception. And bylaws, on the other hand, most states don't. I'm actually not aware of any states that require you to file your bylaws. There may be some, so that's definitely one to check on. But typically, the bylaws are an internal document that's really about how the organization is governing itself. It doesn't mean that that you're not legally bound by them, but they're not something that you you know, that are out there in the world on your Secretary of State's website or something like that. Okay, move to the next slide. Thanks. So, with that in mind, let's move back to bylaws and think about what is it that helps us. What are some of the what are some of the things that we can use in an approach that will help us draft them really well? The first one I would say is that to really treat it both with a diligence and enthusiasm. And I certainly work with a lot of people who kind of dread the bylaws, who think that they're really dry, who find them to be difficult to understand sometimes or confusing. And I actually am a huge advocate for seeing the bylaws as a powerful document that they are for creating the foundation and the basic agreements for your co-op. And so, you know, kind of understanding the import of that work when you jump into it is a really great way to not only have great bylaws, but actually have fun doing it. I swear to God, you can have fun with your bylaws. The next thing that I would say is that it is a difficult thing to do with 9 people to actually, you know, draft a document of that complexity. So it's okay to use a committee to get started, but boards of directors should keep in mind that the whole board is responsible for the content. And what I mean by that is the whole board is bound by what's in the bylaws, the whole organization is. And at the point when the board brings it forward to the membership to approve, to adopt, to revise, the whole board should be recommending that as something that the board thinks is right for the membership to consider or to endorse. And so everybody should really understand what's in the bylaws. And I'll say for an existing co-op, whether you've been in business for 6 months or 60 years, anybody who serves on a board of directors should read their bylaws and have enough fluency in them to kind of know what they say. So, okay. So here's the thing. It's interesting, like if you actually go looking from state to state, you may find that in some states there might not even be an actual requirement that you have bylaws. You may be listed as something that's optional. Now, I don't know of a single co-op that doesn't adopt bylaws, because you actually do want to articulate and have some control over these important provisions. The thing to understand is that in your state co-op statute, at least in some states, there actually may be a series of default provisions that are essentially the bylaws that govern you if you don't adopt your own. And so it's really good to be familiar with those, both because if you don't speak to it, then that provision will govern. But the other thing that you want to be aware of is that state statutes are often drafted like you can, if the bylaws allow, you can do X, Y, and Z. So kind of knowing that you're being given an opening to do some things if you affirmatively choose to do so by drafting bylaws. And then also to be aware that there's some minimums that the state's going to set that you can't draft around with bylaws. So a great example is quorum. In my home state of Minnesota, our co-op statute says that the quorum is 10% of the membership up to 500 people, and after that it's 50. So it kind of set, like the bylaws can go higher, but you can never go below that. So you could never have bylaws that say, oh, just 5% of the people can, you know, act on behalf of the membership here in Minnesota anyway. The other thing I like to remind people is to actually, especially for an existing co-op, is to check your articles of incorporation, sometimes through messy drafting, sometimes just because of, for a lot of reasons, we can have some provisions in our articles that don't necessarily need to be in there, but if they are, that's fine. But what we don't want to have is duplication between the articles and the bylaws unnecessarily, especially because what can so often happen is folks will go in and fix it in the bylaws and forget to fix it in the articles. So be sure that anytime you're going to do anything with your bylaws that you're harmonizing it with your articles. Okay, so here's a big tip, and this is, I'm just happy to say this in great big red letters, just never copy and paste another co-op's bylaws. Definitely look to them for inspiration to see how other co-ops are doing, but the straight-on cut and paste just doesn't seem to work very well for people, in part because you tend to replicate mistakes and you tend to adopt practices without really understanding what you're doing. Instead, we recommend that you start with a solid template. We think that the CDS Consulting Co-op is a great start. There's also a template to be found in the primer for legal formation of co-ops, and that document is available on the FCI website, and the link is in the resources at the end of this presentation. So next, and this really actually is a very natural that flows very naturally from the previous point, which is that you really want to be intentional and very careful about creating your ownership structure, about your member rights, and about director responsibilities, among many other things. And those are three that I call out because they're kind of some of the most important and where we might see some variation among co-ops. But to really be sure that you're doing that work with a lot of intention and care, which is why the cut and paste just doesn't work. My final point is that, and you can click to the next point because here's what I really want to say. Yeah, let's just not do that. We really want to commit to having clear and comprehensible, precise language, but really kind of everyday business language was the tone that I would strive for. And I really call this out, and I'll just out myself. I don't practice law, but I do have a JD, and so I have had times in my life when I have been guilty of probably using some aforementioned and henceforth. But I really strive to rid my writing these days of anything like that. I'm a strong believer that these kind of documents need to be used. They need to be understood by the people who are using them, and so really striving for that level of comprehensibility is not, it's really something that is a feature of great bylaws. All right, so for startups, what this often looks like is that the organizers actually draft the initial bylaws and and often actually adopt them, have them in place, and then depending on both practice and also what is in your state law, again, bring them forward for ratification by the members at the first annual members meeting. So that would be a pathway for startups. For existing co-ops, when we're really talking about a bylaw revision, first of all, one thing to be aware of is that in some states, board members can be empowered to actually make bylaw amendments. Now, typically, if the board amends the bylaws, it would need to bring those amendments forward for ratification by the members at the next annual meeting. And the other thing to keep in mind is if that's even available to you, you would need to have your bylaws specifically empower you to do that. So you might have a state statute that says, provided that the bylaws allow it, the directors can amend the bylaws and then bring them forward. Or it might have some other variation of that, but that's just something to be aware of. Now, I will say this as a matter of practice, if board members are empowered to amend bylaws and they decide to do it, it's probably going to be more appropriate and less controversial to reserve the exercise of that duty, the exercise of that power for things like technical fixes. So if you have something really big and controversial and something that's going to represent a really significant change for your co-op, might not be the best time to exercise your power to do amendment within the board. So the more typical scenario, though, the one that I probably see more often, is that the board actually does the work to draft the amendments based on everything that it's been studying and learning, and then brings it forward to the membership to either vote up or vote down. So that would happen typically at an annual meeting by ballot. Either way, though, it's really important to keep in mind that because this is such a fundamental way that the members empower the board and give direction to the co-op, it's really important for any of these changes to be explained fully to members, for them to really have an opportunity to see the reasoning behind the bylaw revisions, and then to have an opportunity to be in conversation and ask questions. So however you structure that, being sure that it's a full and complete engagement process that gives people the chance they need to understand is really critical. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Thane to take us on a tour of the sample bylaws.
So there's a link to the CDSCC Fresh Start template at the end of these slides. And this is intended as a sample. So what we're going to do here is take a sightseeing tour of the words that are in the bylaw template so that you get a sense of the flow of a standard set of bylaws, and so that I can sensitize you to a few issues that commonly come up. So this Fresh Start template was drafted with an eye towards both brevity and clarity. And Leslie and I were privileged to work with our colleague Michael Healy, who is absolutely fierce about not using words if you don't need them. And so one of the things that's modeled in this sample is an economy of language that I think is worth modeling and adopting. The other thing that's modeled throughout this template is preservation of flexibility for your co-op as it grows. One of the things you can do with the words you choose is provide room for your own growth. So, for example, in this purpose statement, you'll see that it's a very broad purpose statement. Encompasses, any number of possible business enterprises or other outcomes that the co-op may seek to achieve. Boards that typically use a policy governance framework, for example, or some other method of articulating the purpose of their co-op will typically do that within board policy rather than in the bylaw document. What we're trying to draft is bylaws that will last for many, many years of your co-op. Next slide. First article is about membership, and as you'll see here in these simple sentences, again in the non-discrimination section, this template is again modeling using concise language that is it's inclusive rather than exclusive. So rather than have a language, with specific laundry list of things that would constitute, improper discrimination, this language is very broad, so that as we continue to evolve and mature as a society, this language will continue to protect the broadest inclusive participation in our cooperatives. The admission section keeps the requirements for admission very simple, contribution of equity, and points out that, as in the eligibility section, legal entities or corporate persons as well as natural persons can be members of the cooperative. This means that in the admission section, it's important to preserve the one member, one vote principle, that an entity that isn't an individual, say another co-op, identify an individual to act on its behalf with respect to exercising the rights and responsibilities of membership. Next slide. Two key pieces of the membership article, specifying the rights of membership, and keeping those very simple. Of course, there are plenty of intangible rights of co-op membership, but foundationally in the bylaws, at a minimum, the right to elect the board, to attend board meetings, to get notice of those meetings so you can actually attend them, to petition for special meetings, to present issues to the board, and to approve bylaw amendments are all fundamental rights of membership. Rights are correlated with responsibilities, and so there's another section of the bylaws that talks specifically about responsibilities, and again, very simple. In this framing, stay current in equity investments and keep the co-op informed of your current name and address. This is important, as we'll talk in a moment, about making sure that the co-op has the best possible opportunity to retain equity in its organizational structure. There are state laws, which we'll talk about a little bit more, which when property is abandoned, for example, if someone moves out of town, out of state, doesn't change their address with the co-op, co-op is not able to contact that person who owns the equity. And in some states, the state is going to reach out and vacuum that unclaimed property up. But in many states, it's possible to include provisions in your bylaws, and we'll model some of those in a minute here, that will allow the co-op to retain that equity. At any rate, to avoid that mess, make sure your bylaws place a responsibility to keep address information up to date. Termination of membership is an unfortunate provision. It is one that we don't see typically. These are last resort provisions. It's important to include them, but as you're drafting it, keep in mind that what we see as co-ops use these very rarely. You want to be sure that when membership is terminated, that there's process around the termination so that everyone experiences the process as fair. And again, these are rarely used, but it's important to have this provision in your bylaws for extreme circumstances. Next slide. This next provision, return of equity, is just taking care of the practical housekeeping matters associated with terminating a membership. Making sure that in a fundamental fair manner, the equity is returned to the member who has left the co-op. The next section talks about unclaimed property, and this is modeling the ability of the co-op to retain equity that's fundamentally been abandoned at the co-op. We can't contact the member, and we're trying to identify the status of that equity. You will want to check with your attorney about how to draft this, because as I say, state law varies considerably with respect to how this kind of property is handled. But this sample models the most favorable interpretation for a co-op, which if you're privileged to use it under your state law, it's a good idea to do it. And then the last piece is just as to non-transferability. This is another important principle. Co-op membership is voluntary. We want people to take it on intentionally. It does not make sense to have people become a part of the cooperative without giving some thought to the rights and responsibilities of membership. And so the non-transferability provision, small little provision, very important. Next slide. Another big chunk of the bylaws speaking to member meetings and decision making. This is how we live the democracy of our co-ops, making sure that we have an annual meeting and that we make provision for calling special meetings. Notice in here we've included samples for numbers how many active members need to sign a petition to call a special meeting. This is a quorum issue, and we'll talk in a minute about additional places where you need to think about how many people it takes to make a certain kind of decision within the co-op. It's a very important piece of democracy that we figure out something less than the whole is empowered to make a decision, but which decisions can be made and by how many people is important. As you'll see in these bylaws, most of the decisions are made by the board, and that's a fairly small group of people, and that makes sense because a small group of people can come to a place of wisdom and really study an issue and make good decisions. The purpose of these sections and the next ones are to make sure that you're clear about how you're going to gather and have meetings. State law, again, will dictate how you give notice of meetings. And this provision, again, models drafting favorable to the co-op. Leslie had mentioned in her presentation that state law often has default provisions that will govern if you aren't specific about a particular item or issue in your bylaws. For example, how notice is given. And you'll notice that this particular notice provision is drafted to require only posting of the member meeting to be effective notice when you post it, for example, in the co-op. One reason to be careful and attentive to what the state law defaults are and what you're allowed to do is that mailing of notice is very expensive, and for smaller co-ops can be prohibitively expensive. So being sure to avail yourself of the efficiency of minimal legal notice, recognizing that, of course, you will give as much notice as possible because you want people to turn out for your meetings, if only so you can make quorum. Next slide. Decision-making is important to specify in the bylaws. Here we model decision-making through paper or electronic ballots. Time was when it was the most common thing to turn out a whole bunch of people at your annual meeting and make decisions right there. But increasingly, people are less and less able to show up at member meetings, and as our co-ops get larger and larger, just as a practical organizational matter, that kind of decision-making is less and less efficient and less likely to represent the will of the whole group. So this models balloting. And the quorum provision that I mentioned here is important to give some thought to, not only with respect to how your co-op is at the moment that you're drafting the bylaws, but also looking ahead to the future of your co-op and its growth. Next slide. One of the things I like about these provisions with respect to the board of directors is that we are trying to model some things that we see commonly work well for co-ops. So here, specifying how many directors. Occasionally you'll see it drafted with a range of directors. But that often, especially when there's disagreement on the board, which we hope there's healthy disagreement all the time, right, and still the ability to come to a decision, the sliding scale on the size of the board can become a tension point. And I think that's probably not a great use of our time to figure out how to leverage the size of the board. So I think bylaws are strongest when they're specific about how many directors. Here we have 9. I would say we see a range of between 5 and 13 directors being common board sizes. In choosing your initial board size, you're trying to weigh effective discussion and decision making. Past 13, it gets tough, right? There are a few 16, 21 member boards that I've had the privilege to work with, and it's just a more cumbersome discussion with larger people. Smaller numbers run the risk of not having an adequate number of directors to fulfill statutory minimums. So you're trying to bridge the difference and choose a number that is going to be wise. Because it can't be representative. Your co-ops are going to be much too large for direct representational democracy in the sense of proportional representation. So never mind that for the moment. Just think about what's a group size that's going to be strong and have good process for your organization. What was that last piece? Something on that slide I wanted to speak to. Yeah, eligibility. Important to take into account conflicts of interest. And important to be clear, the problematic conflicts in a co-op, because there are always conflicts, right, are typically the ones that aren't disclosed. And there are certain kinds of conflicts that you want to be able to call out and specifically exclude people from serving on the board if they are possessed of a conflict so continuing pervasive that they can't effectively fulfill their fiduciary responsibility. It's important to have language that allows you to exclude people from eligibility for the board. It's very rare that this subject comes up, but if it does, you will want to have something in your bylaws to rely on. Next slide. Make sure your bylaws speak to terms and election. This shows a standard pattern of 1/3 of the directors up for election so that you have continuity of experience on the board, but a reasonable number of seats coming up every year. It's important to make sure the bylaws are specific about how vacancies are filled and what happens when a vacancy is filled. Does the appointed director just complete the term, right? So if somebody resigns from the board in year 1 of a 3-year term, your newly appointed director will serve the remaining 2 years, or does the newly appointed director serve out until the next annual meeting? Those are 2, check state law to see what the default is, and then consider as you're drafting the bylaws which way you want that one to play out. Removal of directors is one of those, like termination of membership. We hope you don't have to use it often. If you need to use it, you'll be glad to have it. Here you see a supermajority, a 2/3 majority of directors required to remove a director. That is, it's chosen to reflect the gravity of the decision that's being made. And you'll see that again in the amendment of bylaw provision. Some co-ops actually have a supermajority there too. Next slide. It's important to have a piece of your bylaws that talks about board meetings and how notice of board meetings will be given. Notice that this is a practical provision as we've drafted it here. 5 days notice of the board meeting, but if you show up at the board meeting, even if I tell you I didn't get notice of it, if Leslie lets me know that the meeting's happening and I show up, I have waived my right to that written notice or to challenge the lack of written notice. This has the practical impact of making sure that I can't be disruptive and challenge, later try to undermine a decision that was made at that board meeting by calling out a technicality on the notice requirements. In other words, we're going to have agreements that prevent us from quibbling about things that don't matter. Constructive notice. The other thing that's here that's important is specificity about what constitutes executive session. In the rights of the members, we pointed out that one important member right is to attend board meetings. There are rare circumstances, however, when the board needs to go into executive session and excuse its members from the meeting, and when in fact the members would really prefer not to be in the room. That's because there are certain confidential or proprietary matters that the board of directors will discuss that it doesn't serve anyone to have members present for. So having specificity in your bylaws about that gives notice to members that that will happen from time to time. It normalizes them. And it also allows you to go and consider, should we go into executive session? It doesn't mean, because executive session can be abused, right? So you want your bylaws to prevent the board of directors from meeting in secret, basically. Next slide. Action without a meeting allows the board of directors to make a decision outside a meeting when exigent circumstances require it, or when there's just a routine decision that we didn't get to make. We were supposed to sign that application for the liquor license, and we didn't do it right at the meeting. Paperwork wasn't ready yet, but it comes in, and this allows you to take action by, for example, signing everybody. So notice that this is a different quantum for decision making. Here the quorum talks about decisions made in regular meeting being made by a majority of directors. in action without a meeting, everybody has to affirm the decision. So if you have something that not everyone can sign, what the bylaws here would provide is that you have to have a meeting so we can figure it out, and you have to give 5 days notice. So it's an elegant safeguard in here. You'll again, of course, want to check with state law and see what is allowed. Next slide. Here stating specifically that directors are under an obligation to disclose not just actual but also potential conflicts of interest and absent themselves from discussion of conflicts. It's very important to have these provisions as part of the bylaws. It is one of the things that demonstrates to prospective board members what is inherent in the fiduciary responsibility that they will be undertaking. And it also sends a message to those who would do business with the corporation that procedural safeguards are in place to prevent abuses. 410 is one of those examples of brevity. State law typically is clear about what officers are required. You can add additional detail in here, but there is a question about whether or not it adds to the readability and is actually tremendously meaningful to your co-op's members. Next slide. It's important to have a provision about indemnification. Check to see what state law provides for indemnification. Occasionally, it will be that indemnification for directors is only available if the bylaws have specified it. So this is a provision that's important to include and to harmonize with the statute you're incorporated under. Next slide. A couple pieces of financial language in the bylaws. Leslie mentioned earlier that it's important not to restate the capital provisions in your bylaws. You wouldn't want to either make an error in transcribing them into your bylaws, or worse, change them and then have them end up inconsistent with your articles of incorporation. However, language about patronage dividends is very important to include. First of all, so that you have been specific about the co-op's authority to allocate and distribute net profit to member owners from the business that's done with them. But also, this consent provision in 5.2 is required in order for the co-op to take advantage of the favorable tax treatment of the allocation of net profit and reduce its own tax liability. So when someone becomes a member of the co-op, by virtue of this provision in the bylaws and your requirement that they be willing to uphold the bylaws as co-op members, they have taken consented to accept the allocated patronage, which is, as I say, necessary for the co-op to have favorable tax treatment. Next slide. We hope you never need the dissolution and liquidation provision of the bylaws, but write it carefully, as if you might, and consider what level of decision-making is appropriate should that circumstance come to pass. It's a substantial decision, so here you see a supermajority in terms of who's participating, but notice that it's of the member owners who participate in the vote, and there's more flexibility about the quorum here. That's because if you come to use this provision, likely you're going to be in a situation of some extremis where time may in fact be of the essence. The other important piece of this provision is specifying the order of disposition of the assets of the co-op. And again, state law will guide you with respect to that, and your attorney can help with that. Next slide. Be sure to specify how the bylaws can be amended specifically, and consider not only whether or not it's appropriate to have and whether it's allowed for the board to adopt bylaw amendments, or as is more commonly seen, a certain number of members need to participate in that decision. Always with quorum decisions, you're really weighing achievability with the number of people who need to be involved in the decision to ensure that it's representative of the whole organization. So you want decisions to be made by enough people that a co-op can't be overpowered by a minority, but at the same time you want to be sure that it's achievable. So there it is as to bylaw amendments. won't say any more. Let's just look at the next slide and just a few sort of to repeat, right? Things that I have already quite thoroughly probably addressed. But listen, it's important to have a lawyer review your bylaws, and a lawyer who's trained in the co-op law of your state, just to make sure that you're consistent with state law. Be sure you've addressed unclaimed equity to avoid it as cheating to the state. Deal with conflicts of interest. Do not duplicate the capital structure from your articles of incorporation. Let that live in your articles and keep your bylaws free of those provisions. And just Leslie mentioned how important it is not to just wholesale copy another co-op's bylaws, because you can import not only errors but cultural practices that you may not want to replicate. There are some things that we've seen over time that are just sensitive issues. Independent nominating committees are increasingly, it's hard enough to find people to serve on a board, never mind to also staff an independent nominating committee. But also that can breed this sort of internal paranoia within the organization where the nominating committee can be, at odds with the board, and you can just have this strange dynamic which doesn't really add value for the members or clarify issues. Be careful. Decision making by members, if it's only made in person, you're limiting the pool of people who can participate in those decisions. And one practice we had here in Syracuse of allowing members to make motions from the floor years ago, created some really interesting unclarity about whose decisions, whose responsibility is it to make some decisions. So again, confining your decision making to balloting is a helpful process there. I think now, if you have had the patience to hang with us, if you have questions, I think this would be a good time to see if we can respond to anything that our remarks might have brought up for you. Next slide.
Thank you. We do have a few questions. Somebody is asking if they are incorporated already, how soon should they write their bylaws? Can it wait until they're further along on a membership drive?
Leslie?
So I would say that I would be working on them. I'm not sure from the question how far along the person is in a membership drive. So a lot of times, you incorporate so that you can open a checking account, essentially. It's often the thing that motivates you to do that. And so if you're kind of still working on just trying to get the first 50 folks to demonstrate very initial back-of-the-envelope interest and feasibility in the idea of starting a co-op, diving into bylaws may be a little bit premature. But it wouldn't be too much into stage one where I would really begin thinking about it, in part because understand that you really,